The morning Harold Stenson found the girl, he had been awake since 4. That was nothing new. Sleep had not come easily to him in the 3 years since Margaret passed. 3 years of lying in a house that was too large and too quiet, in a bed that still felt wrong on one side. He had learned to stop fighting it. By 5 most mornings he was already dressed, already standing in the kitchen with his coffee, watching the gray light come up over Lake Ontario through the window above the sink. That particular Tuesday in November, he drove to the job site early. His company, Stenson Development, was finishing a mixed-use build on the East End, 12 floors of condominiums above 3 floors of retail. Harold had been in commercial real estate for 31 years. He had built half a dozen towers in this city. He did not need to be on site before sunrise checking concrete pours, but he went anyway, because going somewhere felt better than standing still. The site was on a street that cut through what used to be a warehouse district. Most of the old buildings had been torn down in the past decade, replaced by condos and coffee shops and dog-grooming boutiques. But 1 block east of the site, a cluster of original buildings remained, low brick structures with boarded windows, the kind the city had not yet gotten around to demolishing or restoring. Harold was walking back to his truck when he heard it, a sound, small, persistent, coming from the narrow gap between 2 of the old brick buildings, half hidden behind a dumpster. He almost kept walking. He was 58 years old and had learned, as most people do by that age, that the world contains more sorrow than one person can address. He had given to the food bank. He had written checks to shelters. He had done his part, or told himself he had. And it was cold that morning, genuinely cold, the kind of November cold that gets into the joints and stays there. But the sound came again. He stopped. He walked to the dumpster and looked behind it, and what he found there stopped every thought in his head. A girl, sitting on a flattened cardboard box with her back against the brick, knees pulled to her chest, wearing a thin jacket that was not meant for this weather. She might have been 10 or 11. She had dark circles under her eyes and a scratch along her left cheek that had dried to a thin, dark line. She was holding a plastic grocery bag in both hands, pressed against her stomach like it contained something precious. She looked up at him. She did not look frightened. That was the thing that unsettled him most. She looked at him the way a child looks at something familiar, assessing, careful, but not surprised, as though men in good coats finding her behind dumpsters in the early morning was something that had happened before and had not yet turned out to be a problem. "You okay?" Harold said, which was a stupid question and he knew it. "I'm fine," she said. Her voice was quiet and steady. "It's about -8 out here." "I know." He crouched down because standing over her felt wrong. "What's your name?" A pause. Then, "Ivy, how long have you been out here, Ivy?" Another pause. She looked at the grocery bag in her hands. "Since yesterday." Harold felt something move through his chest, not pity exactly, though that was part of it. Something older. Something that had to do with the fact that he had a daughter once. A daughter who would be 24 now, who had died with her mother in the accident on the 401, and was buried in the cemetery on Bloor where Harold went on Sunday mornings when the guilt got too heavy to carry alone. Something about this girl's stillness reminded him of Claire. The way Claire used to go quiet when she was holding something she didn't want to drop. He stood up. "Come on," he said. "There's a Tim Hortons 2 blocks over. Let me buy you breakfast." She didn't move. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't." She studied him for a long moment. Then she stood up, tucking the grocery bag under her arm, and followed him. Her full name was Ivy Marsh. She was 11 years old. Harold learned this over 2 hours, and a bowl of oatmeal and 3 hot chocolates, which she drank slowly, wrapping both hands around each cup, like she was trying to absorb every degree of warmth from it. She had grown up in Sudbury with her grandmother, a woman named Ruth, who had raised Ivy since she was 3, after Ivy's mother left for Vancouver and never came back. Ruth had been the kind of grandmother who kept a vegetable garden in the backyard and made soup from scratch on Sundays and read aloud to Ivy every night until Ivy was old enough to read back to her. Ruth had died in August, a stroke, sudden, in the kitchen, a Tuesday morning just like this one. After that, Ivy had been placed with a cousin of Ruth's in Barrie, a woman she had never met, a woman who had taken her in not with warmth, but with the particular resentment of someone who had been handed a responsibility they hadn't asked for. 6 weeks later, Ivy had taken what she could fit into a plastic grocery bag and gotten on a Greyhound bus going south, because south was the only direction she knew to go. She had been in Toronto for 4 days. Harold listened to all of this without interrupting. He was a man who had built his success on listening, on hearing what people actually needed, rather than what they said they needed. He sat across from this 11-year-old girl in a Timmy's on Eastern Avenue and listened, and something happened to him that hadn't happened in 3 years. He forgot for a while to feel hollow. "Where were you planning to go?" he asked. Ivy wrapped her hands around her third hot chocolate. "I don't know yet. Is there anyone else, family?" She shook her head slowly. Ruth said there was an aunt somewhere in the States, but she didn't have her number anymore. Harold looked at the scratch on her cheek. "How did you get that?" She touched it briefly. "A fence." He didn't ask more. "You can't sleep behind dumpsters in November," he said, not harshly, just as a fact. "I know," she said. "I was going to figure something out today." The thing about Ivy Marsh, the thing Harold would come to understand more fully over the weeks that followed, was that she meant it. She was not a child who exaggerated or performed helplessness to generate sympathy. She stated things plainly, she thought practically, and she had a stubbornness that was not the tantrum kind but the quiet kind, the kind that gets a person through things that would break someone less anchored to themselves. Harold drove her to a family shelter on Parliament Street that morning. He spoke to the intake coordinator himself, made sure Ivy had a bed and that the staff had his number. He left his card on the front desk and told them to call if anything was needed. He told himself that was enough. He drove to the office. He sat through 2 meetings. By noon he had called the shelter 3 times. He visited on Thursday with a backpack. Inside it, a winter coat, proper this time, waterproof, with a real hood. A pair of insulated boots in the size the shelter coordinator had texted him. A book. He'd stood in the Indigo on Yonge Street for 20 minutes, trying to guess what an 11-year-old girl might want to read, and had finally asked a teenager browsing nearby, who had recommended a novel about a girl who discovers she can talk to animals. 3 apples, a package of good cheddar. He was not sure why he had included food. It seemed right. Ivy was in the common room when he arrived, sitting at a table doing something with a deck of cards, not playing solitaire exactly, arranging them in patterns he didn't recognize. She looked up when she saw him. She didn't smile right away, but something shifted in her face. A softening, a loosening, the expression of someone who had expected to be forgotten and hadn't been. "You came back," she said. "I said I would." She looked at the backpack. "You didn't have to bring anything. I know." She accepted it the way she accepted everything, without performance, without the effusive gratitude that makes the giver feel better more than the receiver. She simply took it, looked inside, pulled out the book and read the back cover with focused attention. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it, and that was all. He visited again on Saturday, and the following Tuesday. He started bringing chess problems on index cards. He wasn't sure why, and discovered that Ivy, who had never been taught chess formally, was able to work through them with a lateral thinking that surprised him. She approached the board the same way she approached everything. Quietly, attentively, willing to sit with a problem until it opened. The shelter coordinator, a woman named Sandra, told Harold on his 3rd visit that Ivy's case was being reviewed by the Children's Aid Society and that a longer-term placement would need to be arranged. "What does that mean?" Harold asked. "It means foster care, most likely. She's in the system now." Harold drove home that night and stood in his kitchen for a long time. The house was large and quiet. His coffee went cold. He looked out at the lake. He thought about Ivy at a table doing card patterns alone. He thought about Claire's room upstairs, which he had not changed in 3 years, because changing it felt like a second burial. He thought about a lot of things. He called his lawyer the next morning. The process was not quick. Harold had expected that, or told himself he had. What he hadn't fully anticipated was the particular texture of bureaucratic scrutiny, the home visits, the background checks, the interviews in beige-walled offices with fluorescent lighting, the documents that required notarization, and then more documents that required additional notarization. He was asked on 3 separate occasions to explain why a 58-year-old widower with no living children and a net worth somewhere north of $40 million wanted to become a foster parent to one specific 11-year-old girl he had found behind a dumpster 7 weeks ago. He gave the same answer each time. "Because she needed somewhere and I had somewhere." It wasn't the whole answer, but it was the true part. What Harold did not say, could not quite say, not yet, was that somewhere in those 7 weeks of Tuesday and Thursday visits, of chess problems and hot chocolate and conversations that ranged from the practical to the surprisingly philosophical, he had come to understand something, that the hollow feeling he had carried for 3 years was not only grief. It was also the absence of being needed, of being a father. He had been very good at it, with Claire. She had told him so, in the way teenagers tell parents things, sideways, accidentally, in the middle of conversations about something else. He had stored that knowledge carefully, and then she was gone, and there was nowhere to put it anymore. Ivy needed exactly the kind of attention and steadiness and quiet reliability that Harold had always been good at giving, and Harold needed, more than he had admitted to himself, to give it. He passed the assessments. The temporary foster placement was approved on a cold Friday in January. He picked her up from the shelter on a Saturday morning. She had the backpack he'd brought and a second bag the shelter had given her, and she stood outside on the front step in the new coat with the real hood, while Harold put the bags in the trunk of the Volvo. "This is weird," she said, not unkindly. "Yes," Harold agreed. "It is. I've never lived in a big house before. It's too big, honestly. I've thought that for years." She considered this. Maybe it just needs more people in it. Harold looked at her over the roof of the car. For just a moment, just one, something moved across his face that he would not have been able to name. Then he cleared his throat and opened the passenger door. "Get in," he said. "I thought we could stop for breakfast on the way." The drive took 40 minutes. They talked about the chess problem he had brought on their last visit, the one she had solved in a way he hadn't anticipated, coming from an angle he hadn't considered. She explained her reasoning in careful, linear steps, the way she explained everything, and Harold listened and thought, this child is going to be something remarkable. The house was on the escarpment above the lake, not in the city proper, far enough out that you could hear the water on quiet nights. Harold had bought it with Margaret when they were both 34, before they had money enough to really afford it, because Margaret had stood at the kitchen window and looked at the lake and said, simply, that she wanted to stay. And Harold had thought, I want you to have everything you want. So they had stayed. Ivy stood in the front hallway and looked up at the ceiling, which was high, with exposed beams that Harold had always loved. "It smells like wood," she said. "There's a fireplace in the living room. I had it going last night." "Can we make one now?" Harold smiled. It happened before he decided to do it. One of those involuntary things. "Sure," he said. "I'll show you how." The months that followed were not seamless. Harold had not imagined they would be. There were nights when Ivy woke at 2 or 3 in the morning, disoriented, calling out for Ruth. Her grandmother's name hanging in the dark house with a weight that Harold could feel through the walls. He would go to the doorway of her room, Claire's old room, which he had finally carefully made into something new, and speak quietly until the dream loosened its hold. He never went fully in, not at first. He understood the need for proximity without intrusion. There were mornings when Ivy was entirely closed, when she answered questions in monosyllables, and moved through the house like something still deciding whether to trust it. Harold did not push. He had learned with Claire that the way to reach a child who is retreating is not to follow but to remain, to stay visible, steady, available, and let the child come back at their own speed. There were also afternoons that surprised him, afternoons when Ivy came home from school and sat at the kitchen table and talked for 45 minutes straight, about a girl in her class who had been unfair, about a project on indigenous land use that had made her angry and curious at the same time, about whether a person could be brave and scared simultaneously. That last question Harold answered carefully because it mattered. He told her about the day he had walked into Margaret's hospital room after the accident, knowing she was not going to come home, and how frightened he had been, and how he had done it anyway and had held her hand, and had talked to her even though she could not answer, because being there was the only thing left to give. Ivy listened to this very quietly. Then she said, "That's the bravest thing I've ever heard." Harold had to look away for a moment out the window, at the lake. "I don't know about that," he said. "But thank you, sweetheart." It was the first time he had called her that. Neither of them acknowledged it. But something changed slightly after that afternoon, a small shift in the air between them, a settling. In March, Harold's business partner, a man named Gordon Achterberg, invited Harold to bring Ivy to a charity gala. The firm was co-sponsoring downtown. Gordon had known Harold for 22 years. He had watched Harold grieve Margaret and Claire with the muted, methodical devastation of a man who does not know how to fall apart in public. He had been cautiously relieved, and then genuinely moved, when Harold told him about the foster placement. "She'll be bored out of her mind at a gala," Harold said. "Probably," Gordon agreed, "but it would do you good to take her somewhere nice, show her that world exists." Ivy was not bored. She wore a dark green dress that Harold had taken her to buy on Bloor Street, and she stood next to Harold with the same quiet attentiveness she brought to everything, watching people and listening and asking. Afterwards, in the car, sharp, precise questions about who those people were and what their companies did and how the charity money actually got distributed and whether the cause was one that people at the gala genuinely cared about or one that was mostly useful for photographs. Harold answered every question honestly. "You're going to be very dangerous," he said. "When you grow up." "Dangerous how?" "Smart. The kind of smart that makes powerful people nervous." She thought about this. "Is that a good thing?" "In my experience," Harold said, "yes." The formal foster care arrangement became a formal adoption application in June. Harold's lawyer, a woman named Christine, who had seen Harold through the purchase of his first building 30 years ago, and through Margaret's estate 3 years ago, and through each iteration of the paperwork that had followed Ivy into his life, told him the process would take time. "It always takes time," Harold said. "Yes," Christine said, "but this one I'll move as fast as it can go." What Harold had not anticipated, what no one had warned him about specifically, though he supposed he should have expected it, was what happened in August. A woman arrived at the offices of his lawyer with a claim. Her name was Sandra Marsh. Not the Sandra from the shelter, a different one, and she was the aunt who had been somewhere in the States. Ivy's mother's sister, who had been in Tucson for 7 years and had only learned of Ruth's death, and of Ivy's disappearance from the Barry placement in June. She had spent 2 months trying to find out where Ivy was. She sat across from Harold in Christine's office, a woman in her late 30s, tired-looking, with Ivy's same careful dark eyes, and she said that she wanted to be part of her niece's life, that she had not been there before. She knew that, and she was not going to pretend otherwise, that she had left her family's life for reasons that were complicated and were not entirely her fault, and were also, in part, her fault, and she had made peace with that. But Ruth was gone, and Ivy had no one left, and that meant something. Harold was a man who understood the weight of being the only person left. He did not fight her, he also did not step back. What happened worked out over 6 weeks of conversation involving Harold, Sandra Marsh, Christine, a mediator from the Cass, and, crucially, Ivy herself, who was consulted at every stage, and whose opinion was treated as the most important one in the room, was something that did not fit neatly into any legal category, but worked anyway. Sandra Marsh moved to Toronto. She found a job in the city. She was an occupational therapist, quietly competent, not unlike her niece. She had dinner with Ivy on Thursday evenings. She came to Ivy's school concert in September. She called on Sunday afternoons, when Harold and Ivy were usually in the kitchen making something unhealthy and watching the lake change color with the season. Ivy never had to choose. That was the thing Harold had been most afraid of, that this would become a situation in which a child was required to sever one connection in order to keep another. He had refused to allow it. He had been, Christine told him afterwards, unexpectedly formidable in those meetings. "I've built 40-story towers," Harold told her. "I know how to hold a structure up." The adoption was finalized on a Thursday afternoon in October, 14 months after Harold had found Ivy behind a dumpster on a cold November morning. It happened in a judge's chambers, not a courtroom. Quiet, simple, a few signatures and a handshake, and a judge who said the sorts of things judges say and clearly meant them. Ivy wore the dark green dress again. Harold had not suggested it. She had chosen it herself. Afterwards they drove to the lake. Not to the house, not yet. To a spot Harold knew on the escarpment where you could stand and see the water all the way to the horizon. And on clear days you could almost convince yourself you could see across to the other side. It was cold again, the same November cold, and they both stood with their hands in their coat pockets looking at the water. "You know," Ivy said after a long time, "I was thinking about something." "What's that?" When you found me, you almost walked past." Harold was quiet for a moment. "You noticed that? I notice everything." He turned to look at her, this girl who had arrived with nothing in a grocery bag and had made a home out of a house that had not been one, who did chess problems with lateral thinking and asked sharp questions at Gallus and woke up at 2 in the morning, still calling for her grandmother, and who had in 14 months, without either of them fully deciding to, become the person Harold could not imagine the morning without. "I'm glad I didn't," he said. Ivy looked at the water. "Me too." The wind came off the lake, cold and clean. Somewhere above them a flock of geese crossed the gray sky in an uneven V, headed south for the winter, calling to each other in voices that carried a long way in the still air. Harold thought about Margaret. He thought about Claire. He thought about the way grief works, not like water draining from a tub, getting less until it's gone, but more like the lake in front of them, always present, changing with the light, and still capable, on the right morning, of being beautiful. He reached over and put his hand gently on top of Ivy's, where it rested on the railing. She didn't say anything. She just turned her hand over and held on.